Hi there. So I have a bit of a different video for you today. As you can probably tell, I'm going to be talking about books that I read in 2020. I think when a lot of people create these style of videos where they're doing reviews of a large swath of time, they often end up talking about the best or worst books from that period of time. This is not what I'm doing in this video. This video is focused on books that I couldn't stop thinking about after I read them. There was something about them that stuck with me, whether that be something that bothered me about them in some cases, or questions that they unearthed for me. There's just something about these books that I've continued to think about since I've read them. So I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about the books and maybe covering a little bit of why they stuck with me. So the first two books are the only nonfiction books on the list, and they are both included because they're kind of about place. They both made me think more about where I grew up, and they made me think a lot about how place affects who we are, how the places that we spend a lot of time in and the perception that people have of those places can impact how we operate in society. So the first book is What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia by Elizabeth Catte. It is one that I have talked about before. I had a Dear Traveler video on it. I'll link it up here or maybe down below. And it's a really short volume that is mainly dedicated to refuting Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. If you're not familiar with Hillbilly Elegy, it was a hugely successful memoir. I believe you would categorize it as a memoir about someone who grew up in Appalachia, and he characterizes the region in a way that Elizabeth Catte, who is a historian, found harmful. I think there are a lot of dangers to characterizing entire regions as one very specific thing. Appalachia is often used as a scapegoat for the nation's problems. There's this perspective that it exists to bring everyone backward, that the only people who live there are white and poor, and that there isn't really a history there. The history is kind of erased into this kind of stasis land where nothing changes. I hope that made sense. But essentially, reading this book reminded me of how I felt about where I grew up. I didn't grow up in Appalachia, I grew up in the Midwest, but there are very similar attitudes to where I grew up as there are to Appalachia. And when I lived there, I didn't really have a sense of the history of my state or even of my town necessarily. I think I kind of bought into this harmful myth. And you know, I was reading an interview with Alix Harrow. Alix Harrow is a writer of speculative fiction, but before she was a writer, she got her degree in history, and she did an interview with her alma mater where she talked about growing up in a small town in Kentucky. And she said that growing up, she was only familiar with a history that was small and ugly, but getting her history degree revealed to her that there was this history of radicalism and dissent and human rights activism that had been totally hidden from her. And that resonated with me. And I think that's part of the reason why this book resonated with me, because it is a reminder that there's so much more history to where you are living than probably what you were aware of. And if you grew up in a place that is traditionally used as a way for people in power to not take any sort of responsibility, then your sense of where you grew up is absolutely damaged by that. The other thing that I will say is, while I think this book is very good if you've read Hillbilly Elegy and you want another perspective on the region, or if you kind of want a general introduction to what it isn't, you want some refutation to some of the stereotypes, I think this is a good place to start. However, it doesn't spend a lot of time talking about what Appalachia is. There are a few mentions of Black organizers in the region. There's talks about how people in power kind of leverage poverty to bind others closer to white supremacy. but it's a very small segment of the book. Even smaller is the segment on LGBTQ rights, on Native American rights. In fact, I think there is a single sentence where it talks about land rights for Native American and indigenous people in the region. And so I ended the book with more questions about that than I had answers, and I wish that the book had been a little bit longer, so it could have included that. I think it would have been a worthwhile inclusion. However, I definitely want to read more history about the region and also about the region that I grew up in. The second book is very different. The second book is a memoir by Sarah Broom. It's called The Yellow House. And in it, Sarah Broom reflects on how where she grew up kind of haunted her in her later years. This is how she characterized it in an interview. So on the surface, the book is about Sarah Broom's experience growing up in a deteriorating house that, on one hand she loved, but on the other hand that she felt bound to. It's about how a place can continue to affect you even after you leave it. In another interview, she talks about how she felt there was a disconnect between where she was and where she grew up. At the time, I think she was in New York. She had been traveling internationally. I think to some people, she might be considered a success. I think sometimes when you grow up in poverty-stricken areas, when you grow up in areas that have had to face disasters, leaving that place is a marker of success, right? And I remembered feeling a similar way where I grew up. And so that was something that really resonated with me, because the other thing is I do love where I grew up, but it has affected how I've moved through the world, and I do feel bound to it in some ways. I also feel like I've changed and I'm different from where I grew up, and I don't feel like I totally fit where I am now. So that kind of internal struggle, it was something that I've continued to think about. I think where Sarah Broom further elevates this book is it's not just about her own experience growing up. Although I do think that is very valuable, she also deftly manages to fit it with her family history and also with how that fits into society overall. Because the reality is the house that she lived in when it was first purchased was a wonderful house, and it was through a series of events within her family that were heavily influenced by society and how society treats Black people that led it to what it became when she was living there. She talks a little bit about coming back after spending years in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world, deciding to come back right around the time of Hurricane Katrina and getting caught up in that, and her mother getting caught up in that, and the house being destroyed by the hurricane. The government then gave people an option. They could either leave and take some money, or they could rebuild, and her family chose to rebuild. So they filed all the correct paperwork, and then they waited and waited and waited, and they were passed from case manager to case manager to case manager, and ultimately by the end of the book, the house was never rebuilt. And in an interview, Sarah Broom talks about the feeling that as a Black person, your country, your society, the people around you do not care about you. And this was a demonstration on a huge policy level of how that manifests. But she also links that to history even earlier on, because when there were thriving Black neighborhoods in New Orleans, governments rammed highways through them. The entire design of a city is affected by racism. And if we ignore that, we're ignoring a big part of not just Sarah's life, but the experiences of many people in this country. If you do decide to read this book, I would highly recommend reading some interviews with her as well. I've linked some that I found illuminating, interesting, amazing down below. The next book that I want to talk about is one that I remember seeing in bookstores on and off for what felt like years. I would keep picking it up. There was something about the cover that was very interesting to me, and I would read the description and I would be like, this sounds like something I would really enjoy. And then I would put it on the shelf again until finally last year I picked it up and I bought it, and that book is Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfeld. When I reflect, I think I was maybe a little bit intimidated by this book because it did promise a kind of light magic touch, a sort of folk magic and a mystery and atmosphere. All of these things are almost like auto buys. When I see them in a book, this is exactly what I want, I pick it up. But it seemed maybe a little bit too literary for me, and I guess I worried that I wasn't ready for it. And reading this, I was proven wrong because I loved it, even though the aspect of the book that drew me the most to it, the folk magic aspect, proved to be much later than I thought it would be. The story begins near the Thames, where a small girl is rescued from the river and deposited at an inn. Immediately, the reader and the characters are asking who the girl is and where she came from. On the face of it, the novel is dedicated to unraveling this mystery, but it's so much more deep than that. So because the child doesn't really speak, the question of who her family is becomes challenging for the innkeeper, and that's further complicated when several families show up to claim her. This book is really for a patient reader, someone who's willing to learn a lot about the different families and the girl, rather than read for the thrill of a mystery. It's not that the book doesn't try to solve this mystery, it's that everything occurs in a very kind of slow, winding way, much like the Thames. There are several perspective characters in the book, and they're all very distinctive. I have my favorites, but I've never felt bored when I was with another character. Folk tales, mystery, a slice of life, all of these aspects are very expertly woven into the story by Diane Setterfeld. And I have to be honest, part of the reason why it stuck with me is not just because it is superbly written, but I think it encourages me to step outside of my comfort zone more. I spent so much time afraid to read this book, thinking that maybe I wouldn't really understand it, or it was too advanced for me, or something I wasn't really interested in. And actually, this is one of the books on the list that was one of my favorite reads of the year, and is probably one that I will revisit later on. The next book is another fiction book. It is called The Hakawati by Rabi Alameddine. And it was a book that I picked out in 2020 for a video series idea that I had. And I did end up filming a video for it, but I scrapped it because I hated it so much. And so for a while I thought I would maybe never talk about this book, but I still keep thinking about it. I read it at the very beginning of 2020, and it is now 2021, and so like it's been a full year. And here I am, and I still think about it occasionally. So the story is built around a young man named Osama who returns home to Lebanon to sit by his father in his final days. Over the course of these days, as he sits by his father's bed, he tells stories. And as he tells these stories, you learn more about Osama's life. You learn about his grandfather, who is also a storyteller, his entire family. You learn about his experience growing up during the Lebanese Civil War, his experience leaving, and you also get to hear some kind of remixes of different epics that you've probably heard before in some way or another. The name is fitting, as the word Hakawati in Arabic is a teller of tales, fables, and myths. The word Hakaya in Lebanese means to talk, and the author writes at one point that this suggests the mere act of talking is storytelling, and I love that so much. I will say in the beginning, the parallels between Osama's life and his family's life and the epics that he sits and tells by his father's bedside are much sharper, but somewhere towards the middle, I feel I start to get a little bit lost. There kind of comes a point where there's almost a Matryoshka doll of storytelling, where you're kind of 4 layers deep and all of these stories are running at the same time. There are points where these epics are kind of contradictory, and I'll be frank, For some readers, some of what is kind of being portrayed in the book might be uncomfortable, and I certainly found myself uncomfortable for a couple of moments. It sometimes felt like he was more interested in updating the language of these epics than their content. So it wasn't always clear to me what he was trying to do by including them. At the end of the story, Osama has a conversation with his uncle about the nature of stories, about whether they're truthful or not, and what that means, about what the stories tell you about the storyteller and what the storyteller is trying to communicate. Because of course, stories can be twisted to put certain people on pedestals, to tell a certain version of reality, because even fiction is kind of communicating a little bit some form of reality, some form of morality. And that conversation tempered my frustration a little bit and redeemed the book for me a little bit. Something else that surprised me was how much more I was interested in the stories from the family as opposed to these epics. I thought going into it that I would be totally riveted by the myths, but sometimes I found myself wanting to skim the myths just so I could get back to this family, see how they were doing, see what they were doing. Their lives were so much more interesting to me. A lot of books say that they're stories about stories, but I often find that they are so in a vague sense, and sometimes they're even a little bit ham-fisted. Almadin's The Hakawati is about stories in a way that I haven't seen before, and that's partly due to all of these different nested levels of stories and the fact that he gives equal time to these epics in the real life. The book is partly about the stories that we tell ourselves and how the stories that we tell ourselves, about other people, about where we're from, are large parts of who we are. And I think that, for me, is the most important part of this book. Ultimately, I'm not sure if this is a book that I will ever reread, but it is one that I am happy to have read. The next book I want to talk about is a very popular one on BookTube, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie Larue by V.E. Schwab. And I picked it up because the premise sounded really interesting to me, and I think it delivered in a lot of ways. It's magnificently written. The story is about a girl who makes a deal with a dark god in exchange for living forever, or living for as long as she wants her soul. She gives up kind of the ability for other people to see her or interact with her in any meaningful way. She gives up the ability to be remembered, and part of what it's asking is, what is a life like when you can't be remembered? Something that V. Schwab said is, it's a terrible thing to forget, but in some ways it's so much scarier to be forgotten. And I picked up this book in a really hard time in my life. I just lost someone I care about deeply. So when it ended on this very victorious note, to me it felt forced. It felt like Schwab was trying to say something about legacy, about this idea that the ultimate victory is to have this larger than life legacy. And at the time that really bothered me. Upon reflection, I think that it fits the book, but I'm someone who really prefers quieter endings, so it didn't quite resonate with me. I think this book is also a very personal book. It's filled with V.E. Schwab's foibles and fears, and that is where the book is the strongest. It is these small moments of humanity and the way that she's able to capture some of the anxieties that a lot of us have, the anxieties of being forgotten and the anxiety of trying to be the perfect person, the person that people will like. Those were the parts that I loved the most. There were so many moments in the book where characters expressed feelings of longing, anxiety, depression, fear, hope that resonated with me, not just because I've experienced those things, but because of the clarity with which Schwab expresses these ideas. As I said, these smaller, more personal moments are vastly more intriguing to me than some of the larger, sweeping things that Schwab tries to do. And in fact, I think if you examine the book from a larger social context, it fails. Because Schwab does try to include some of the history. When you write an immortal character, a lot of the decisions that you have to make as a writer, I guess this is also true for any book, but in particular, I think about the challenges with immortality, are about what you decide to leave out. You know, what parts of history are you not going to talk about? What is the focus, the scope of this novel when it spans hundreds of years with one person? And because Schwab chose to include some major historical events and major figures and not others, the reader starts to wonder why. You know, why is it that Addie keeps meeting these really famous artists who, of course, also made deals with the devil? Why are we talking about the French Revolution in passing, but we're not talking about leaps and bounds that we've made in terms of achieving human rights? Why aren't we talking about the things that we haven't achieved? How is it that Adelaide is so focused on the bounds of her own curse, on how to live a lonely life and how to find joy, and how to, you know, kind of develop resilience and the resolve to survive when you can't make meaningful connections? There doesn't seem to be a lot about what she's observed about the world around her, which has changed tremendously. So because she chose to include some of these major historical moments, but not others, you start to wonder why. Why is that? If you read the book, and I still do think it is worth reading, I would keep that in mind, and maybe, I don't know, I hope that you can find value in these smaller moments like I did, because I think that is what makes the book shine. And in some ways, if Schwab had made the scope of this novel a little bit smaller, I think it could have been stronger. So beyond kind of those smaller personal moments, another reason this book stuck with me is it's so well written. It's something that I would like to write someday. Some of the imagery is really gorgeous, and the book just seems to flow. It has just the right amount of sparseness. It doesn't feel like she's trying to cram too much into the book, with the exception of some of these bigger sweeping things that I mentioned. And it's just so clearly skillfully written. And it also made me ask myself a lot of questions about some of my own anxieties and my own fears and what it takes to overcome them. So I think there's a certain degree of inspiration that you can draw from this book. Okay, so I think that's everything. Whew, we went through a lot of books. Thank you for sticking with me. If you have any books that have really stuck with you over the last year, I'd love to hear about them. What were they? Why did they stick with you? Did they stick with you because you loved them, or did they stick with you because you hated them, or just because there's something that you thought about because of them? Tell me all about it. I think that's all I have to say about that. So I hope you all have a lovely day, and until next time, keep traveling. Bye.